Welcome to today's New England HIMSS webinar, How a Healthcare Organization Improves Reliability and Performance for Their Users, presented today by Brian Martinowitz, Director of Sales and Engineering at Logon BSI. All lines have been muted upon entry, so please send your questions via the Q&A feature and he'll answer them during the presentation. Brian is responsible for ensuring operational excellence in crucial architecting solutions within customer environments. Having worked in IT consulting for 18 years, he loves to share field engineering expertise and customer service management expertise with others. Please join me in welcoming Brian today.
Super pleased to be here. Thank you for that, Elisa, and that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to talk about an organization that I worked with. I'll give you the details on that here shortly, in the healthcare space and how they kind of took a transformational journey to really hone in on reliability and performance, specifically around their user experience on top of their IT platforms. So as Lisa said, I work for Logon BSI. I'm the Director of Sales Engineering and Solution Architecting. It means I work with our customers to understand the value of bringing in technology and the benefits that it has on their business. So my keyboard is working here, guess not. We'll use the arrows instead. So the organization that we're talking about is Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. It is in Buffalo, New York. It's quite a fantastic medical operation. In fact, our previous PMO, Cassandra Rivers, her mother had cancer, and unfortunately, she ended up with Roswell, and we know firsthand of what a wonderful organization it is. So it consists of about 40,000 employees. On a yearly basis, they're looking at about 231,000 outpatient visits. And it was formed in 1898 as one of the world's first institutes dedicated to cancer research specifically. And also interestingly enough, they were one of the first organizations across the United States to test for COVID when the pandemic really kicked off. So wonderful organization. And I was very fortunate to have the privilege to work with them on this project that they had ongoing. So wanted to set the stage, a little bit of brief technology history. So in 2005, they really started adapting Citrix and presentation server, as it was called at that time, 4.5, to their particular use cases. And that was published applications, specifically all scripts. That's their crown jewel, their EMR, where they drive the operations of their business. So they have a long history at this point with that particular technology stack. And as you can imagine, trials and tribulations and various progressions, the system kind of evolved. So in 2011, they were still running XenApp 6.5, Allscripts 15.1. And the highest watermark that they were seeing at that period of time was 632 continuous users. So, within healthcare organizations, people are constantly badging in, badging out, walking the floor. This was the amount of live users on that system at that period of time, 2019. You'll notice that they're still running XenApp 6.5. Now they're on Allscripts 16.3, and they're looking to go towards the long-term service release of Zen Desktop at that period of time. And that's really when Logon as an organization and myself got involved with Roswell to continue to expand on the technology that we're relying on to kind of humanize this, because a lot of the people in the audience may be in technology themselves. So they were using HPE Synergy servers as an on-premise deployment. At the time, they were running Windows Server 2016, and since then, obviously, they've moved off of that platform. They were using VMware's ESX hypervisor technology to facilitate all of this on the back end. So they had a bunch of strategic concerns, which I can imagine people on this call share as well. We really had no proper metrics to define resource requirements for when they were doing major migrations or upgrades within their environment. They don't have a test environment to do large scale testing. So there was always an inherent amount of risk associated with changes that they were making. So they could do some smaller scale individual testing and some QA efforts inside of those application ownership teams. But as you may or may not be aware, within large scale enterprise deployments, these environments become segmented or siloed. And so, changes would manifest and kind of be thrown over the wall. And when they would get to certain scales, they would find issues, and that was using real users versus synthetic or robot users, which is problematic in and of itself. They needed to know, how many servers that they needed, how many users they could get on each server, what would be a desired outcome as far as a logon time, because when we talk about EMR systems, it's just at the end of the day, human beings interacting with them. When you log into a system, that's very tangential. You can feel that when you're opening up those applications, when you're interacting with those applications, that's how the users experience the systems. But login time was a concern of theirs because they had a history of inconsistency around that, and they wanted to clean that up and improve it. They want to know how many blades for their hypervisors. They had instituted previously unsuccessful changes within their org. And so there was a bit of gun shyness around it. Hesitation slows down the change management, change release process. And obviously there's a risk still there. Also, they wanted to know how they could change out physical hardware components successfully and seamlessly without having downtime or impact on the end users. Again, they wanted to build up that confidence. That's typically what the change management process entails, is building a level of confidence. You understand what the change that you need to undertake is. You can easily commit that change for the most part, but then the question is really, will this stand up to the test of production, and how will they know that it's going to work? They need all major releases to be seamless, and basically what will happen the next time there is a change inside of their environment. Will it stand up? Will they have user experience issues? Will they have user functionality issues where things don't work? And they want to avoid that entirely. They also had some generic organizational requirements, and that may be because of particular compliances that they have to undertake. Well, they needed to do a load test, and sometimes insurance companies will require this to test your disaster recovery environments in disaster recovery scenarios. They want to do a stress test. They wanted to mimic user behaviors versus looking at real users and what their behavior would do to the systems, because it's all relative. It depends upon what time of the day, their particular workflows, whether or not they've had lunch, if they're doing the same sort of behaviors. And so that was creating some inconsistency in their results. They wanted to gather metrics based on testing around those user experience points that I had spoke of previously. They wanted to mirror the number of logins that they had per minute based on what they were seeing in those high watermark, high logon threshold scenarios. And then they wanted to look at those metrics and understand what they needed to migrate, what they needed to upgrade, and what issues they needed to mitigate before they would roll them out. So some goals that they had when they brought Login in were looking at response times for each transaction inside of all scripts. They wanted to see what the system components look like, not under the real load, but under the scenarios that they could recreate in their laboratory environments, to have that consistency of testing, to see what the system components look like. They wanted to understand what the database performance looked like, and as that impacted the performance of those different workflows. They wanted to be able to monitor the network delay between where the client is sitting and where the server software is taking place. They wanted to mitigate some software design issues that they had exposed in the past. They wanted to see how their servers, like their web servers, their application servers, their database servers, any of the servers that supported their users, they wanted to take a look at in more depth. And they also wanted to load test to determine whether the system could be further optimized or fine-tuned, and if they could make performance gains in the software or hardware configuration, such as power setting, BIOS levels, moving user storage locations around from hardware to hardware, and different software versions. What was the best configuration for their particulars? So what we did was we came in after understanding the requirements of their organization, and we started to interview them around what their clinicians, their doctors, their nurses, their administrative employees, what they did within Allscripts. So we came up with a pretty generic workflow that encompassed a lot of the usual behaviors that were taking place on top of their platforms for supporting this application, which were things like starting the EHR up, logging in, going through the various modules that they have. So, you know, they may have radiology applications, for example. They may have more specifics to a specific specialization, X-rays that get pulled in, whatever that might be. They wanted to actually look up patient records, which would test out the ability for the system to support that behavior. They wanted to do patient record searches. These are ordinary behaviors that users using these systems would do. They're loading those records up. They're looking through and scrolling through patient demographic information. They're clicking through various windows and elements of that patient's information. They're opening up health issues, and they're going through the prescription writer. And by creating a workflow that mirrors this type of behavior, they now have a consistency, the ability to do A/B testing comparison. And that's great, because what they can do is they can make granular modifications through the change process to understand what that does inside of all of these specific interactions, which drive the business itself, right? It's tangible, the impact that it has on the organization, their ability to look up a patient or create a record or look through the modules or pull up an X-ray. Literally, it could change the amount of patients that this organization could see on a day-to-day basis, one patient per employee. And obviously that has a compounding or residual effect. So these were very important steps in their workflow, and they use this as the basis of their testing operation. Now, since then, they've built this workflow out, but this is what they kind of started with. So I thought that it made sense to actually give you a visual representation of what that looks like in a practical sense. So you can see, you know, two specific users here clicking through the various tabs within Allscripts, looking up records, you know, dealing with various pop-ups and requirements for accessing the information in various layers, and continuing to generate that level of robotic or synthetic workflows against those systems, you know, going through Citrix to get to those applications, right? And so what they would do is they would go back through those set of steps that we had talked about before, and it's checking it from a functionality standpoint. So, you know, if I was able to look up this patient record before, now all of a sudden Patch Tuesday comes along and I'm continuing to run this testing methodology against my platform, I can see that if the change that I introduced either broke it from a functional or performance standpoint. And the way that I'm doing that is from replicating what the user is actually doing on their day in and day out basis. And I can do that on a continual basis into production. I can do that in an isolated test bed where I'm running an individual virtual user to walk through that workflow. I can also multiply the number of virtual users, increase the logon rate, put the system under strain for increased durations of time, really with the intent and purpose of understanding if the modifications and changes that I'm making in my environment are having an effect on either the function or the performance of the behaviors that drive my business. So what we were able to do is we were able to constantly check performance and availability of applications through their practitioner workflow. Just visually kind of like what that looks like. From a workflow perspective, we talked about the iterative testing cycle. So we would create that workflow, we would run it through, and we would understand what the averages max, mins, and baseline transaction times were within those systems and within those applications. We then increased the number of sessions. So if I go back to my previous slide, you can see I was testing out 15 users here. You can see the active number of user sessions here down at the bottom, the number of users and those aggregate response times. So originally I'm testing one virtual machine that's supported on top of these hosts to understand how many users a virtual machine can handle. I'll then step that process up. So I know, if one virtual machine can handle 15 users, if I have 10 virtual machines, I should be able to run 150 users, but I can actually, instead of just modeling that out, I can take that same workflow, I can increase the number of user sessions, and I can, again, look at those average responsive times, maximums, minimums against my ability to support that on those systems. So then we stepped it up again. So we went from 150 now up to potentially 600 user sessions. Again, keeping an eye on those responsive times in those interactions that the users experience. So logons, starting up the EHR, going through that workload, looking up those patient records, so on and so forth. And eventually, throughout this process, we ended up releasing a new version of the software, but that was just to show you guys that we could continue to test that workflow into production. So now every change that they make, they can actually make an API call to our management server and kick off their testing apparatus to understand if from a functional and performance standpoint, they're able to support that user load from both a load testing scenario as well as an individual basis, a remote location perspective, which I haven't really touched on at this stage. But one of the components of our tests is where those users are sitting. And as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, or on this webinar is aware of, you have a lot more users actually accessing these systems remotely. They can take that same workflow that we've outlined, take one of the components of their testing apparatus, remove it from inside of the organization's on-prem deployment and actually stick it outside and generate load from there, or generate the test from there to understand how the remote geography is influencing their ability to support their user bases as well. And so, basically over the course of 2019 into 2020, they were in the process of going through this iterative testing process to understand if they could improve on the overall user experience, if they could get more users on the system, if they could log into the system faster, if they could access the EHR system faster, if the interactions within those applications were improved. And so what they did to start things out was they reached out to the original manufacturers of the application. And this is a generally advisable step whenever you begin a transformational process, which is understanding the requirements and the recommendations of the vendors that are supporting the applications that you're utilizing. Allscripts was a big one for Roswell. And so they brought in Allscripts Consulting. Allscripts kind of, did this protracted due diligence process where they looked at the system from top to bottom. Are they conforming to the best practices? Are there software updates that they can apply? Are they having storage performance issues? Do they need to upgrade the version of Citrix that they're running? Do they need to upgrade the version of Allscripts that they're running in order to improve the overall user experience? So in January, and my key is actually hidden here, but this is average logon rates as monitored from that real user environment. So they can look at it on their various stack monitoring solutions. So the consultancy company came in and said, the first thing that you should probably do is upgrade the version of Citrix that you're running, because at the time they were still running XenApp version 6.5. And that was very old at that stage. But it also speaks to kind of the heart of the reason why I'm giving this presentation to begin with. It's that in our past lives as IT professionals, we had a much longer window of time where we could go through the change process. I'm thinking Windows 95 to Windows XP to Windows 7, Windows 7 to Windows 8, found out that that was a failure. Then we moved on to Windows 10, and Windows 10 was supposed to be the last operating system, but more or less what it became is a continually changing operating system as a service. So we no longer have, years to sit on a particular release that's supported by a software developer, ourselves included. Logon VSI makes a testing platform, an automated testing platform, or a reliability platform rather, and we make changes into our software, and we can't just assume that people will be running a version of our software 3 years from now. We're making regular and quarterly releases, and the expectation is that they're moving on to these releases on a regular basis. So the same thing applies to solutions like Citrix or Microsoft Windows or Office or Allscripts or semantic endpoint protection or whatever. Windows Environment Manager software, any of the monitoring solutions, they are on this continual upgrading path. So, they said the first things first, let's go ahead and upgrade Citrix, and you can see we're sitting at those baseline logon rates. Once they changed out the version of Citrix that they were running, they actually saw pretty good increases. So this blue bar is going to be your maximum average logon, and we're looking at 110 seconds, which is almost 2 minutes, which is not too bad. We're looking at average logon rates at around 70 seconds, so about 1:10. So that's kind of tolerable. And sometimes it would log in as quick as 50 seconds on average, which is pretty good. Based upon that, and again having that iterative change process, they continued to identify key areas of improvement and optimization. So they then rolled out a new Citrix environment. So they said, we're going to augment our existing Citrix deployment with an entirely new Citrix environment, and we're going to leverage that as additional capacity to support our end users. They then went through and they did a PVS upgrade and migration. So anyone that's familiar with Citrix, PVS is the provisioning technology that they use underlying to configure and distribute virtual machines to support a user basis. There's pros and cons between PVS, which is a more modern standard, and MCS, which is machine creation services, or the previous iteration of that. And so they thought that if they went to this newer technology, that they would then get some performance gains as a result of that. And you can see, on average, they shaved 5 seconds off the overall or high-end logon rate. They shaved about 15 seconds in their average and 5 seconds in the low side of things. As I said before, they were setting up a new Citrix environment. So they were running those HPE Synergy servers, the Gen 9 versions of those at the time. And HP released a new hardware platform, and it was Gen 10. And they thought that they would be able to get performance and efficiency gains out of going to newer hardware, because of course, all vendors and manufacturers are going to tell you that the newest and latest, greatest technology is the best and the fastest. So let's actually test that out and prove it out, and by what margin, on a cost basis as well. So like, how much am I spending in order to improve my overall performance? And so you can say we went from 105 to 100. We went down to 50 seconds. So we have, sub 1 minute logons, which is great. And on the low side, you're seeing 45. And again, they're continuing to track this progression as they monitor their real users and their experience within the systems, looking at those machine level metrics. They thought that they'd have a benefit if they moved to the newest version of NetScalers and storefront servers. So for those that are unfamiliar with Citrix, NetScalers and storefront servers are basically the front end that your end users will log into in order to get to their desktops or their applications. So that's the component that the user had to go through before they would get to Allscripts in this particular instance. And so they were running older versions of this technology, still supported though, right? For HIPAA compliancy reasons, but they felt as if they moved to the newest versions, they would get some performance gains there. And as you can see, we've now down to maximum average logon rate of 90 seconds. with an average of 45 and a low end of 40 here. Now we're in July. At this stage, they thought they had done a pretty good job of, testing things out on their own and implementing the vendor recommendations and specs. But obviously, these things take time, and executing these workflows on their own with real users slows down the process. So they brought Logon in at this period of time, and we created that workflow that we had covered before. And now we can basically make one change, click test again, and see whether or not by looking at our robotic or synthetic users, the Logon experience is getting better or worse. And you can see, they've done a pretty good job so far of optimizing their performance. We went from 128 all the way down here to 85 from a maximum average logon rate. You can see we almost have 30-second average logons if you look at the average and the low end of that. So they're doing a pretty good job. But what I will also kind of point out is there was a lot of performance efficiency gain to be made here when you think about it. And obviously, the more optimization that you get out of the system, it becomes increasingly or exponentially difficult at that stage to determine even more. But they were running this automated testing process. And so they could literally stage and set up a Citrix XenApp environment. They could upgrade, they could migrate, and they could just click test, or even better yet, run the testing through our API as part of their lifecycle management process. And they could, again, look at the things that drove their business, right? Opening up the EMR, logging into it, looking up patient records, going through that day in the life, looking at charts, and so on and so forth, keeping an eye on the interactions within the applications that drive the business itself. So you can see we were able to reduce our logon rates basically in half at this stage. We decreased our average logon time by 2/3, and we cut our low end down by 3/4. So I mean, that's pretty impressive. And also, I would just say generically, this is kind of the level of user experience that most people, when they're consuming IT, and I mean like on their laptops or whatnot, would kind of expect as well. So based on that iterative testing process and that workflow, they were able to come up with some more optimizations and fine tuning of their Citrix environment. We went from 50 to 60 seconds on the high end. On the low end, we got it down to 20 seconds, which I think is pretty impressive. They moved to the latest version of SCCM, which is the management plane for large-scale enterprise IT organizations for managing changes, process, ticket management, configuration management, all of that fun stuff. They also had a bunch of legacy GPOs around, or group policy objects, and I'm sure most of the people on this call that will be listening to this in the future can appreciate how many GPOs can stack up over time. We just kind of keep adding them into the mix or modifying what we have. We don't really understand what the consequences of that is on a long-term basis, but they can actually strip those layers back, reapply them one by one, and then test and see what that performance looks on an iterative basis. So, come around to December, we're starting the beginning of the year. They're continuing to migrate apps onto this platform because it's so much better. It's so much more reliable. They're going to eventually sunset their old school legacy environment, which also decreases the management burden on the organization and further speeding up the change management process. So we talked about, what their plan was, kind of taking to current, what kind of projects they had coming down the line that they were concerned with. In September, they were telling us that they wanted to go from 7.12 to 7.15. And again, if you look back on our history slide that I covered at the get-go, they would stay on these releases for sometimes years at a time. So you can imagine that it's quite exciting that they are able to make a pretty significant change in their software and know that, come 4 months later, they're able to go through that same process again pretty flawlessly and pretty seamlessly based on that success level. So come January, they wanted to go to the newest version of Allscripts on top of that. And then the latest and current iteration, what they're kind of implementing is a continuous monitoring. So they're taking that same workflow that I had talked about before. They're taking those launcher components. That's what we call that. That's where the virtual user instantiates from. They're distributing that to their remote locations, their patient first facilities, their kind of urgent cares, their various hospitals around, and they can continue to drive those interactions with their systems, keeping an eye on whether or not they're functional and performant. So we'll give a little kind of visualization of what that continuous availability testing kind of looks like for them. So they kind of put these virtual users out there looking at things like application failure. So if I was able to start up the application before and go through my set of interactions, am I able to do that tomorrow or the day after or a week later or so on and so forth? If there are logon failures, so we're going to continually log on to that system, and it's going to tell us if there's a consistency in our ability to hit a service level agreement. And ideally, they would always be able to both log in and also log in the amount of time that they're used to as well, right? Because that's one of the ways in which real users experience the systems. Additionally, we'll look at the latency. So if you have these locations geographically distributed, we'll be able to continually probe the user experience from that particular position. So you can understand if a change that you're making in your environment is having a systemic or an isolated impact. So, maybe all of your environments are properly functional and performant, but one of the environments is falling outside of that SLA. And you would know very directly that it's not a systemic issue, but it's isolated. And so that's a very different conversation that we have with our end users. In addition, we're able to look at and get a breakdown on the specifics of the application. So, in this particular demonstration, they're using a 3D radiology app, and they're starting the app up. They're opening up a brain scan. They're actually viewing it, and they're rotating around, and they can continue to look at that type of transaction to understand if it's getting faster, it's getting slower over time. They actually now will rely on the virtual users to create a ticket versus their real users. So I'm sure that we've all had this experience where we get a phone call from someone saying that the system is slow. It's like, well, what does slow really mean for you? Where are you experiencing it? When did it start happening? Is it happening to your neighbor? Is it in an application? Is it a specific interaction within the application that you're having issues with? And so on and so forth. We naturally sort of kind of gather these information bits, but now they'll actually have a virtual user that's walking through a day in the life of their real user, continually executing that workflow that we had talked about previously, and it will actually create a ticket if it can't access the app, or it can't do the function, or the function is slower than it was supposed to be. They'll get those contextual details that helps them to root cause the issue much more quickly. So what was the outcome? Well, the outcome was that they now have a truer picture of the performance of their environment. Previously, the way that they were doing this was they had a variety of technologies that were supporting their entire IT stack that looked at, transaction times on a disk, queue lengths on a CPU, how much available RAM that they had, what was their database transactionary speed looking like. The problem with this was they didn't understand how those things impacted the real users. And so now that they have that workflow as the key piece of their testing vector, they're able to understand a true picture of their performance. They also have the ability now to provide indisputable empirical proof supporting their claims of service and performance delivered to the end user. Previously, it was a very subjective conversation. They could tell you, well, yeah, like last month we were using 80% of our CPU load, and now we're using 90%. And obviously there's a 10% appreciable difference. But what does that really mean? Now they can actually look at that workflow and they can see, are our logins slowing down, or are our ability to look up patient records, is that slowing down? And so when they're making an assessment on whether or not they should install this security patch or look at this security application in their stack or go to this newfangled user profile management solution, they can actually look at their baseline data and compare it against the data from the new configuration. They were able to identify areas that needed improvement. They were not able to previously do this very effectively using their real users because they couldn't isolate the sets of behavior that were being executed. And so, say for example, during my testing period, 50% of my real users decide to step out for lunch. That's going to really screw up my ability to use that as a baseline set of data to identify areas of need. They really could get a true sense of the number of blades they needed to support the environment. And by being able to retest quickly thereafter, they can understand if those requirements change. Or if a new hardware version were to get released by HP, they can then quickly take that new hardware into their testing facilities, publish some applications or desktops on top of it, run that same workflow back against that environment and understand whether or not they need to purchase additional hardware, or if that manufacturer specified solution that they tell you is going to improve performance by 50%, if it actually does or not, or if that has a tangible impact on the areas of your business that you actually care about, those workflows that we had spoke about. They were able to identify the number of servers that they needed to support 1,100 users, which I guess at that particular time was the number of concurrent users that they would support at any given moment. They would understand what an average user logon should look like because they really didn't know. They had now an idea of what they could expect going forward when they take these changes into production. And this is the key one, they now have confidence to move forward with both major upgrades and minor changes, knowing there would be no issue. Whereas before, there was some level of manual testing that was taking place. They were analyzing the data, but there was still a level of risk associated with it. And now they feel much more confident about that. So at the conclusion of things, when I had wrapped up with them, and I continue to keep tabs on them even to this day, they're doing an excellent job of institutionalizing change management within their organization. And I think that this speaks volumes to their ability to in turn support their customers. So they have a very high satisfaction rating amongst people that end up at Roswell, and it's well deserved. They were able to go to the latest version of Citrix at the time, which was huge for them. They had several successful migrations. There was minimal impact as far as from a user experience perspective, as well as from a downtime perspective. It was almost like a light switch cutover. In addition to that, they saw dramatically improved logon times, as I demonstrated in the set of data that I walked you guys through. They improved the performance and the user experience overall. They created a more stable environment, so less outages, less user experience complaints as a result of this hygienic testing methodology. The vendor is able to more easily support the environment because they can actually show them the test results and communicate through data. They were able to secure the environment because now they can actually roll those security changes, those upgrades, those patches into the environment much more readily. With a much higher level of confidence. They're able to continue to improve the end user experience. And as I demonstrated with that chart, it's obviously a lot easier to go from 2-minute logon times down to a minute logon times. But once you're there, it becomes more difficult. But they believe that they still have room to continue to improve, which is great. And they can quickly change. They can quickly change and test and evaluate the impact of unplanned changes like security updates and vulnerability patches, and also as part of their regular patch cycle. So organizations typically of this size take about 70 days to roll patches out. And that's from discovery to the due diligence, the testing, the user acceptance to production, and they can continue to expedite that to make sure that they're not leaving themselves vulnerable to any kind of breach. So realistically, what this meant for them is a fundamental shift in the way that they've done business. We all experienced the impact of pandemic and working from home, and it just kind of exposed a lot of efficiencies, which frankly were quickly responded to. I think for the most case, organizations did a pretty good job of sending a large swath of their end users home, operating on these remote systems and augmenting their technology to ensure that they're providing good experience to their end users as well as their customers. And I think that that's pretty universally accurate. Companies have decided and figured out that they need to really respond quickly and frankly faster than they had ever responded to these things before, because who knows what the next unprecedented outcome is. And also, like, this almost was a load test of sorts for cloud options. This really, it brought to the forefront organizations' need and necessity for having the ability to run their workflows on the cloud. And so they were, initially dipping their toe into cloud service providers, be it, Citrix Cloud on AWS or Azure, Windows Virtual Desktop or Azure Virtual Desktop, as it's called now, Horizon Cloud, and so on and so forth. But now they're really identifying that it is in fact a solution to a problem that they have. And by having that workflow and that comparable baseline, they're able to very easily understand whether or not the cloud and its operational model is an option for them. So with that being said, I know I am wrapping up approximately 15-ish minutes before I'm supposed to, but I've sort of run out of content at this stage. We were hoping to receive some questions along the way, and we very well may have. Maybe Elisa was just too kind to interrupt me in the midst of the flow that I had going. So at this stage, I'll sort of pause and see if there's additional questions.
Yes, feel free to send any questions that you might have for Brian, either to the Q&A or the chat feature. Both are available to you. And we'll just remind everyone that after you exit the session today, there is a survey. So if you do think of another question for Brian, or you would like Brian to reach out to you, there's a place in the survey that you could put your information so he can do that for you. And the CP HIMSS credit will be sent to you after the register session, along with this handout. We will have this in PDF so that you can refer back to all of Brian's great information that he shared today.
Fantastic. And so if there aren't questions, then what I'll leave you guys with is I greatly appreciate you sharing some of your time with me today. I'm really excited and I'm encouraged as I see more organizations in the healthcare space increasing their test coverage, increasing their test hygiene, rolling out changes faster. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Brian. And just to remind everyone, Brian and other of our sponsors will be at the May conference, which the registration is open. So please come join us for our next big in-person event on May 12th. And thank you today, and have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian.